In the final years of World War II, a secret American unit waged war not with bullets, but with illusions. Known as the Ghost Army, this 1,100-man force was armed with inflatable tanks, sound trucks blasting fake convoys, and actors posing as generals. Their mission? To fool the Nazis into seeing armies that didn't exist. From Normandy to the Rhine, they staged entire fake divisions, drawing enemy fire away from real troops. It was theater on a battlefield, camouflage turned into strategy. For decades, their story was classified. But how did artists, engineers, and sound designers become soldiers of deception? And how many lives were saved by shadows and smoke? War is not always fought with bullets and steel. Sometimes it is fought with illusions, with phantoms conjured out of smoke and sound, with shadows that march across the mind more effectively than soldiers across a battlefield. In the Second World War, a conflict that spanned continents, consumed millions of lives, and pressed human ingenuity to its breaking point, there emerged a unit so unusual that its very existence remained hidden for decades. This was the Ghost Army, a force that waged war not with firepower but with deception, a masquerade of inflatable tanks, false convoys, and voices carried on the wind. To understand how such an extraordinary idea came into being, one must first step back into the world of 1944. Europe was fractured, cities smoldering under bombardment, and the Nazi regime still commanded much of the continent. The Allies, despite their victories in North Africa and the hard-fought invasion of Italy, faced the daunting challenge of penetrating Hitler's fortress Europe. With D-Day approaching, the need for ingenuity was at its highest pitch. The Allies did not merely need men, tanks, and aircraft. They needed to outwit an enemy that had entrenched itself with fortified defenses and formidable intelligence networks. Deception, then, was not a novelty but a necessity. The history of warfare is littered with examples of feints and ruses, from the Trojan horse of antiquity to the false campfires lit by generals to suggest armies where none existed. Yet in 1944, with modern technology, radios, and reconnaissance planes altering the way information was gathered, the stage was set for a more elaborate theater of trickery. Out of this crucible emerged the idea for a dedicated unit whose sole mission was to manipulate enemy perception. The United States Army, recognizing that strength alone would not secure victory, authorized the creation of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. This was no ordinary military formation. Instead of gathering hardened infantrymen or armored divisions, they recruited artists, designers, sound engineers, radio specialists, and stage magicians. These were men who, in another life, might have painted canvases in New York, designed billboards on Chicago's boulevards, or crafted stage sets for Broadway theaters. Now, their brushes and talents were repurposed for a deadlier canvas, the battlefields of Europe. Their mission was as audacious as it was dangerous: to impersonate entire divisions of the U.S. Army, to conjure phantom forces where none existed, and to draw the attention and fire of the German Wehrmacht away from real Allied movements. They would be asked to create not just illusions, but convincing illusions. So real that enemy reconnaissance pilots, peering from thousands of feet above, would believe in the solidity of rubber tanks. So convincing that German spies intercepting radio chatter would swear to the presence of divisions that never set foot in that sector. The tools of this ghostly trade were eclectic. Inflatable tanks and artillery pieces, crafted of rubberized fabric, could be inflated within minutes to create the appearance of a battalion ready for battle. Camouflage artists could blend these into terrain, lending them an air of authenticity. Massive loudspeakers, mounted on trucks, broadcast recordings of engines, clattering treads, and shouted commands that could be heard up to 15 miles away. Radio operators sent streams of coded transmissions, designed to mimic the chatter of genuine units. Even soldiers themselves became actors, wearing insignias of divisions they did not belong to, frequenting local cafes, and planting rumors that would, through the webs of espionage, reach German ears. The Ghost Army was not born overnight. Its conception was tied to earlier experiments in deception, particularly the grand masquerades of Operation Fortitude. The Allied planned to convince the Germans that the D-Day landings would occur not at Normandy, but at Pas-de-Calais. In that operation, dummy landing craft and a fictitious, 1st U.S. Army Group, under the command of General George Patton, played a central role in diverting German defenses. The success of Fortitude proved the potency of deception, but it also revealed the need for a mobile, flexible unit that could replicate such illusions on a smaller, tactical scale. Thus, in January 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was formally activated. Secrecy cloaked the unit from the start, even within the U.S. Army. Few knew of its existence or purpose. Soldiers assigned to the Ghost Army were sworn to silence, their very identities hidden within the larger machinery of the war. They were trained not to charge into battle, but to slip into danger's shadow, to set the stage for others while remaining invisible themselves. They would go where real divisions might go, risk being discovered by enemy patrols, and yet never be permitted to fight as conventional soldiers. Their weapons were deception and illusion. Their battlefield was the imagination of the enemy. This approach demanded a special kind of courage. While infantrymen could return fire and armored crews could roll forward under steel protection, the men of the Ghost Army faced German bullets with little more than fabric and sound equipment. If discovered, their masquerade would collapse, and they would be little more than lightly armed decoys against seasoned enemy troops. Yet this vulnerability was precisely what made their work so vital. By placing themselves in harm's way, by drawing enemy attention, they allowed other units, those with real weapons and objectives, to advance with reduced resistance. Every false tank inflated, every fake convoy assembled, was a shield of illusion protecting real soldiers advancing elsewhere. The story of the Ghost Army is, in many ways, a story of art repurposed for survival. It is about brushstrokes that became camouflage patterns, stagecraft that became strategic deception, and soundscapes that became weapons of confusion. In a war often remembered for its machines and its bloodshed, the Ghost Army stands as a testament to imagination as a tool of survival. Yet their contributions would remain cloaked in secrecy for decades, their story nearly forgotten until long after the war had ended. As the shadows of 1944 lengthened across Europe, and as Allied forces prepared to break the back of Nazi domination, the Ghost Army began its work. They were not warriors in the conventional sense, yet their presence would shape the very battles whose names echo in history: Normandy, the Ardennes, the Rhine. These shadows, summoned by ingenuity and bravery, would prove as real as any steel-clad division. Their legacy begins here, in the twilight between truth and illusion, where war itself becomes a performance, and survival hinges on who controls the script. The men of the Ghost Army were not bred for war in the traditional sense. They were not plucked from farms or factories with rifles thrust into their hands, nor were they veterans of earlier battles hardened by trench mud and the acrid smoke of artillery. Instead, they were artists, illustrators, sound engineers, and stage designers. Men who, in another world, might have painted landscapes, sketched magazine covers, built theater sets, or mixed records in the nascent music industry. Yet in 1944, the United States Army summoned them for a different purpose: to turn their talents toward deception, to make their imagination serve as a weapon. It is here, in the unlikely convergence of art and war, that the Ghost Army begins to take shape. The roster of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops included names that would one day echo in the halls of art galleries and design schools. Bill Blass, destined to become one of America's most celebrated fashion designers, once wielded brush and stencil to create camouflage nets that would fool German pilots. Ellsworth Kelly, whose minimalist canvases would later hang in the world's most prestigious museums, trained design not on pure abstraction, but on the deceptive placement of rubber tanks in European fields. Arthur Singer, who would rise to prominence as a bird illustrator, began by sketching dummy artillery positions. The future careers of these men underscore the strange alchemy of the Ghost Army. War transformed their creativity into survival, and survival honed their creativity into art. Recruitment for the Ghost Army was, itself, unusual. The Army's traditional induction centers sought out strength, endurance, and discipline. For the 23rd, recruiters sifted through art schools, design programs, and even advertising agencies. They looked for men with steady hands and imaginative minds, for those who could see the world not only as it was, but as it could be made to appear. This was not about brute force, but about craft, about how an inflatable Sherman tank, properly positioned with painted shadows, could fool an aerial photograph, how a scattering of tire tracks in the mud could suggest a convoy where none had passed, how a single radio signal could masquerade as an entire division. Training at Camp Forest in Tennessee and later at Pine Camp in New York was as much about performance as about soldiering. The men practiced inflating and deflating their rubber tanks with speed, learning how to anchor them so that wind would not betray the deception. They studied camouflage, understanding how light and shadow played across forms, and how the human eye could be misled by careful manipulation. Sound engineers, drawn from radio and film, experimented with recordings of tanks clattering across bridges, trucks idling, and soldiers shouting. They learned how to project these sounds through massive speakers so that, to a German patrol in the distance, it would seem as though an entire armored column was advancing. Radio operators honed the art of mimicry, crafting transmissions so authentic that German intelligence analysts would believe them to belong to seasoned divisions. What emerged was less a military unit and more a traveling theater troupe of deception. Each man had a role to play, and each performance was staged with precision. The visual artists built the sets, inflating tanks and arranging dummy artillery. The sound men crafted the score, filling the night with mechanical roars and metallic clatters. The radio specialists delivered the dialogue, weaving chatter that convinced enemy interceptors. Even the foot soldiers became actors, donning the insignias of divisions they did not belong to, walking into French towns as if they were advance scouts of an entire corps, casually dropping hints for local ears that would inevitably carry the whispers back to German agents. This intersection of art and war was not without irony. These men, many of whom had once aspired to paint canvases of beauty, found themselves sketching for survival, crafting illusions designed to kill or at least to misdirect. Yet there was also a certain nobility in their mission. Unlike many other military units, the Ghost Army's purpose was not to destroy, but to deceive. They sought not to increase the body count, but to reduce it, to draw enemy fire onto phantoms while real soldiers advanced in relative safety. Their weapons were rubber and sound, but their victories were measured in lives saved. The Ghost Army was divided into several key sections, each with its own specialty. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers handled the inflatables and visual deceptions, setting the stage with rubber tanks, jeeps, and artillery. The 3132 Signal Service Company took charge of sonic deception, blasting pre-recorded sounds of armored divisions from powerful loudspeakers that could carry miles into enemy lines. The Signal Company's special created radio ruses, crafting traffic so convincing that even seasoned German intelligence believed entire units were maneuvering. Finally, the 406th Combat Engineers provided the necessary protection and logistical support, ensuring the Ghost Army could set up and dismantle its illusions under fire. Together, these sections formed a unit of about 1,100 men, small enough to be nimble, yet powerful enough to impersonate divisions many times their size. The courage of these men lay not only in their artistry, but in their vulnerability. Their illusions had no armor, their loudspeakers no firepower. If discovered, they would face seasoned German troops with only rifles and sidearms. Yet they stepped forward willingly, knowing that their masquerades might buy precious hours or days for the real divisions pressing the front. Every inflatable tank they positioned, every false convoy they suggested, carried with it the weight of American and Allied lives. Their art was not for galleries, but for survival, their stage not a theater, but a battlefield. As the men of the Ghost Army completed their training and prepared to cross the Atlantic, they carried with them more than gear and equipment. They carried an unspoken understanding of their mission's paradox: to fight a war by pretending to fight, to risk death by impersonating strength. In this paradox lay both danger and brilliance. Theirs would be a war fought not with glory but with guile, not with explosions but with illusions. The next chapter of their story would be written on the fields of Normandy and beyond, where art and deception would meet the brutal calculus of war. By June of 1944, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had crossed the Atlantic, their secret orders folded into the labyrinth of the Allied war effort. As the thunder of the Normandy landings echoed across history, The Ghost Army arrived in Europe not to storm beaches, but to prepare stages of illusion. Their task was subtle yet immense: to deceive the Wehrmacht, to divert divisions, and to protect the fragile footholds carved into fortress Europe by flesh and steel. For the first time, their skills would be tested not in the quiet fields of training camps, but in the unpredictable theater of real war. The first deployments of the Ghost Army were cautious, almost experimental. In the weeks following D-Day, the Allies faced the brutal challenge of breaking out of Normandy's bocage country: dense hedgerows, narrow lanes, and scattered villages that favored defenders. German forces, tenacious and seasoned, struck back with counteroffensives. Every maneuver demanded concealment. Every advance required diversion. It was in these crucibles that the Ghost Army learned to adapt their deceptions to the harsh realities of war. Their baptism came in the form of Operation Brest in August 1944. As American forces sought to liberate the French port of Brest, the Ghost Army was called to create the illusion of reinforcements. Inflatable tanks and artillery were hurriedly deployed along ridges and fields visible to German spotters. Tracks were carved into the soil to suggest armored columns on the move. Sound crews filled the nights with the grinding rumble of tanks and the low growl of engines, reverberating through valleys where no machines actually stood. Radio operators, cloaked in their canvas tents, sent transmissions suggesting the arrival of entire battalions. To German observers, Brest seemed threatened by forces far greater than reality. The deception bought time and disrupted German calculations. Reports suggest that enemy forces diverted men and resources to meet phantom threats, leaving real American divisions to advance with fewer obstacles. Though Brest would remain a brutal, drawn-out battle, the Ghost Army's involvement signaled a turning point. Their illusions were no longer confined to theory. They were saving lives in practice. From Brest, the Ghost Army moved deeper into France, shadowing the surge of Allied momentum after the breakout from Normandy. In September, during the bitter fighting for the Moselle River and the approach to Metz, the unit executed some of its earliest large-scale deceptions. Near the town of Metz, the 23rd staged the appearance of an armored division preparing for an assault. Inflatable tanks dotted the hillsides, artillery pieces pointed toward the city, and the thunder of phantom engines rolled across the fields. Civilians in nearby towns were encouraged to spread rumors of arriving reinforcements, while soldiers wearing false insignia mingled in cafes and markets, sowing whispers that would travel swiftly to German intelligence. The risks were immense. To set up their masquerades, Ghost Army soldiers often worked perilously close to the front lines, within range of German artillery. On more than one occasion, the inflatables themselves became targets. A well-aimed shell could rip through the rubber hide of a fake Sherman, deflating the illusion in an instant. Yet the men persisted, sometimes joking that theirs was the only unit where a bullet could kill a tank. These jokes masked real danger. If German patrols discovered the ruse, the lightly armed artists and engineers would be slaughtered. One of their most daring early missions unfolded at Nancy in September 1944. As General Patton's Third Army advanced, the Ghost Army was tasked with simulating the presence of two armored divisions south of the city. Over the course of several nights, the men inflated hundreds of tanks, placed fake artillery, and broadcast sounds of convoys arriving in force. Meanwhile, radio operators sent carefully scripted transmissions imitating seasoned divisions, complete with call signs, frequencies, and even the casual chatter of soldiers. The Germans, convinced of a looming assault, repositioned forces to meet the phantom divisions. This thinning of defenses allowed Patton's real troops to advance more effectively, capturing ground with fewer casualties. For the Ghost Army, Nancy became a revelation. Their deception had not only worked, but had altered the course of battle. It was the proof of concept they needed, confirmation that illusions could sway the calculations of generals and tip the balance of war. The men began to embrace their identity not merely as soldiers, but as conjurers of fate, wielding rubber, sound, and rumor as instruments of survival. The cost, however, was constant tension. Living in the shadows of their own illusions, the Ghost Army endured the psychological strain of deception. Unlike infantrymen, whose victories could be counted in ground taken, or tank crews, who measured success in enemies destroyed. The men of the 23rd fought battles that left no visible markers. Their triumphs were whispers in intercepted reports, hesitations in enemy maneuvers, delays in counterattacks. They lived in a liminal space, where victory was measured not in explosions but in silence, in the absence of battles that might have been. As autumn descended on France, the Ghost Army's reputation within the Allied command grew. Though still cloaked in secrecy, word of their effectiveness spread among select generals who understood the value of misdirection. By now, the unit had executed half a dozen operations, each refining their craft. Inflatable tanks became more convincing with added details: painted shadows, gun barrels that glinted in sunlight, crews that moved among them to give the impression of life. Sonic deception grew more sophisticated, with soundtracks that could simulate everything from convoys crossing bridges to entire armored divisions preparing for attack. Radio ruses expanded in complexity, with operators weaving conversations, scheduling maneuvers, and even intentionally making mistakes that made their transmissions appear authentic. Yet their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The war in Europe was far from over. The German army, though retreating, remained dangerous and capable of ferocious counterblows. Winter was coming, and with it the desperate gamble of Hitler's Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. In that crucible, the Ghost Army would face its sternest test, one that would prove whether illusions could hold against the most violent storm of the war. For now, however, in the autumn of 1944, the men of the Ghost Army stood at the threshold of recognition. They were still shadows, still whispers, still phantoms. But on the fields of Brest, Metz, and Nancy, their illusions had become real enough to save lives. The artists had entered the war, and their performance was only beginning. The Ghost Army's genius lay not only in its men, but in the strange arsenal they carried into battle. Where other units bore rifles, mortars, and Sherman tanks, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops hauled inflatables, amplifiers, and radio sets. Their battlefield was a stage, and their weapons were props, soundtracks, and signals designed to deceive. To understand their success, one must step inside this arsenal of illusion, a collection of tools so unconventional that, in the hands of lesser men, they might have seemed absurd. The most iconic of these tools were the inflatable tanks. Crafted of rubberized fabric, these ghostly Shermans and 155mm howitzers could be folded, packed into trucks, and inflated within minutes using air compressors. Once fully expanded, they mimicked the silhouette, size, and bulk of their real counterparts. From the ground, a trained eye might spot the difference: the sag of a rubber barrel, the lack of crew bustle. But from the vantage point of a German reconnaissance plane flying at 10,000 feet, the deception was convincing. Shadows painted onto the inflatables deepened the illusion, giving them dimensionality that could trick even sharp aerial photography. To an enemy mapping Allied positions, a field filled with rubber Shermans was a division poised for battle. But inflatables alone could not complete the masquerade. The Ghost Army understood that sight was only one piece of perception. War was noisy, and the absence of sound could betray even the most convincing visual ruse. Enter the Sonic Deception Unit, commanded by the 3132 Signal Service Company. These men carried massive amplifiers mounted on half-tracks, sound projectors capable of throwing recordings up to 15 miles across the countryside. The recordings, produced at Fort Knox before deployment, included the grinding of tank treads, the rumble of convoys, and the clatter of bridge crossings. Engineers layered these sounds to create the impression of movement, adjusting volume and direction so that an enemy patrol might believe an armored column was advancing from one valley into another. In the dead of night, when echoes rolled across French fields, such illusions took on an eerie potency. Radio deception formed the third pillar of the arsenal. The signal company's special became masters of mimicry, studying the unique fingerprints of real American divisions. Every unit had its quirks, cadences of speech, preferred call signs, habits of communication. By listening carefully and practicing, the Ghost Army's radio men could impersonate these quirks, sending transmissions that sounded indistinguishable from genuine divisions. A single operator might create the chatter of dozens, hopping frequencies and weaving scripted conversations that convinced German intelligence analysts of phantom units maneuvering across the front. Sometimes, to heighten authenticity, operators intentionally made small errors, misspoken codes, corrections mid-transmission, that only real humans would commit. These mistakes were their signature of truth. The fourth, and often overlooked, weapon was atmosphere itself. Soldiers of the Ghost Army played their parts like actors, wearing patches of units they did not belong to, painting insignia onto trucks, and scattering fake headquarters signs. In villages, they mingled with civilians, planting rumors that would spread with predictable speed to German informants. An offhand remark in a cafe, a staged complaint about supply shortages, a casual mention of reinforcements. These were deliberate seeds sown into the fertile ground of occupied Europe's rumor networks. The Germans, relying on local intelligence as much as reconnaissance, often fell victim to whispers conjured by these artist soldiers. Together, these methods formed what the army called a multimedia deception. Rarely did the Ghost Army rely on one technique alone. Inflatable tanks without sound might raise suspicion. Sound without visual confirmation might seem hollow. Radio chatter without a corresponding physical presence could unravel under scrutiny. But when all three converged, when inflatables filled the fields, when engines growled through hidden speakers, when radios chattered with false orders, and when soldiers casually dropped hints in taverns, the illusion became nearly impossible to dismiss. The scale of these performances could be staggering. A detachment of barely 1,100 men could impersonate an entire corps of 30,000, complete with armored divisions. Trucks carrying inflatables crisscrossed the countryside, deploying phantom forces where the Real Army could not be. Each mission required not only artistry but choreography, the precise synchronization of sights, sounds, and signals. It was theater under fire, rehearsed in secrecy and staged for an audience of German intelligence officers. Yet this arsenal was not without flaws. Inflatable tanks, for all their realism, were fragile. A stiff breeze could topple them, and an inquisitive farm boy might stumble upon a deflated Sherman hidden behind hedgerows. Once, during a deception near the Moselle, a curious French villager tapped on the side of a tank only to be startled by the hollow thud of rubber. The soldiers laughed, but the incident underscored the precarious balance of illusion and exposure. Sonic deception, too, had its limits. The speakers were cumbersome, difficult to conceal, and vulnerable to artillery fire. Radio mimicry demanded constant vigilance, for a single misused call sign could expose the ruse. Despite these challenges, the Ghost Army refined their craft with each mission. Artists painted details onto inflatables, serial numbers, mud splatters, even canvas tarps, to heighten authenticity. Engineers experimented with acoustics, discovering how to angle speakers so that sound carried naturally across terrain. Radio operators built intricate libraries of German listening habits, tailoring their transmissions to exploit known enemy tendencies. Like true performers, they learned from every audience reaction, adjusting their script for greater believability. This arsenal of illusion was not mere trickery. It was strategy, an extension of the Allied commitment to psychological warfare. By manipulating enemy perception, the Ghost Army forced the Germans into hesitation, overreaction, and misallocation of resources. A phantom division might draw artillery fire that spared a real one. A fake convoy might cause a German counterattack to strike empty fields. Every deception saved lives, and every life saved justified the rubber, the recordings, the transmissions. As the Ghost Army's reputation grew among Allied commanders, so too did their assignments. No longer were they experimental. They became indispensable. Their arsenal of illusions, born in the imagination of artists and sharpened by the urgency of war, was now a weapon as critical as tanks or aircraft. And soon, in the cold forests of Belgium, these tools would be tested in the crucible of the Battle of the Bulge, where illusion itself would help stem the tide of Germany's last great offensive. The winter of 1944 descended upon Europe with a bitter ferocity. Snow blanketed the Ardennes forest, muffling the sounds of war while concealing its dangers. Allied forces, confident after months of advances across France, believed the German army was in retreat, exhausted and broken. But Hitler had prepared a desperate gamble. In mid-December, the Wehrmacht launched a sudden counteroffensive through the Ardennes, seeking to split Allied lines, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. This would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States during the Second World War. And into this chaos marched the Ghost Army, carrying illusions into one of the war's most ferocious storms. For the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ardennes was unlike any environment they had faced before. Their inflatables sagged under heavy snow, their sound equipment froze in the biting cold, and their camouflage patterns disappeared under the monochrome of winter. Yet their mission remained urgent. The German advance threatened to overwhelm Allied positions, and every deception that could buy time or redirect enemy attention was vital. Here, the Ghost Army's tools were tested to their limits, not only against German intelligence, but against nature itself. One of their most critical deployments occurred near the town of Luxembourg City, where German units pressed aggressively toward Allied supply lines. The 23rd was ordered to simulate the presence of two full divisions holding the line. Soldiers labored in freezing conditions to inflate rubber tanks, brushing snow off their surfaces so that reconnaissance planes might glimpse them. Tracks were carved into icy ground with bulldozers, creating the illusion of convoys arriving through the forest. Loudspeakers blasted recordings of armored divisions moving into position, the deep rumble of engines echoing eerily through snow-clad valleys. Radio operators sent transmissions suggesting reinforcements streaming toward the front. The Germans, uncertain of the true strength arrayed before them, slowed their advance, diverting reconnaissance and artillery toward these phantom forces. The Ardennes also tested the psychological resilience of the Ghost Army. Unlike earlier operations in France, where they could often operate on the fringes of battle, here they were dangerously close to the front lines. At times, German patrols passed within striking distance of their positions. Artillery shells landed perilously near their inflatable tanks, tearing holes in the fabric illusions. A single breach could reveal the masquerade, turning the stage into a trap. Yet the men persevered, patching rubber under fire, reassembling sound equipment in the snow, and broadcasting their illusions as if their lives, and the lives of thousands of real soldiers, depended on it. Perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of the Ghost Army's role in the Ardennes was the paradox of their courage. They were lightly armed, their mission designed not for combat, but for deception. Yet in those frozen forests, their vulnerability became a strength. German commanders, perceiving strength where there was weakness, altered their maneuvers. Some units hesitated, others attacked empty positions, and still others diverted resources to counter threats that existed only in the imaginations conjured by the Ghost Army. In this way, the men of rubber and sound became guardians of flesh and blood, shielding real divisions through illusion. The Battle of the Bulge was a crucible not only for the Ghost Army, but for the entire Allied effort. American forces, surprised and battered, held desperately against the German advance. Towns like Bastogne became symbols of defiance, where surrounded troops clung to survival until relief arrived. In that broader struggle, the Ghost Army's contributions remained largely invisible, hidden beneath the cloak of secrecy that defined their existence. Yet their illusions, scattered across snowy fields and forest clearings, formed part of the fragile web that held the Allied line together. The men themselves felt the strain of their role acutely. Nights were long and freezing, their tents offering little warmth against sub-zero temperatures. They joked about the absurdity of inflating tanks in snowstorms, of staging sound effects in forests that swallowed echoes. But beneath the humor lay exhaustion, fear, and the weight of responsibility. They knew that every illusion had stakes measured in human lives. If their masquerade succeeded, real soldiers elsewhere might live. If it failed, the enemy's advance could shatter Allied lines. When the tide finally turned in January 1945 and the German offensive faltered, the Ghost Army withdrew from the Ardennes with quiet pride. They had played their part in one of the war's pivotal battles, though few outside their unit knew the details. Their illusions had helped stall the German thrust, diverting attention and sowing confusion at a time when every hour mattered. The battle would be remembered in history for the resilience of the American soldier for the heroism of units like the 101st Airborne, and for the sheer brutality of winter combat. The Ghost Army, true to its nature, would remain in the shadows, its contributions unrecognized, its victories unspoken. Yet for those who were there, who inflated rubber tanks in snowstorms and projected phantom convoys across frozen valleys, the Ardennes was proof of their mission's worth. They had entered the deadliest battle faced by the U.S. Army and emerged not as casualties, but as conjurers who had bent the tide of war with shadows. Their arsenal of illusion, fragile though it seemed, had stood firm against the fury of the Wehrmacht. And though the world would not know it for decades, the ghosts of the Ardennes had played their part in breaking the last great offensive of Nazi Germany. By the spring of 1945, the Allied advance had carried the war to Germany's very threshold. The Rhine River stood as the last great natural barrier before the heart of the Reich, its broad waters flowing like a moat before a fortress. To cross it was to breach Hitler's homeland. To fail was to prolong the agony of Europe. Every bridge, every crossing, every bend in the river was fiercely defended. Here, at this decisive juncture, the Ghost Army was summoned once more, not with rifles or tanks, but with shadows and illusions designed to shield one of the most daring operations of the war. The Rhine was no ordinary obstacle. Its wide span, swift currents, and fortified banks made any attempt at crossing perilous. German forces, though battered and retreating, had prepared defenses with characteristic rigor. Artillery batteries watched the river's approaches. Infantry lay entrenched in villages and forests, and armored reserves waited for signs of Allied crossings. To mislead such an enemy required illusions of unprecedented scale. The Ghost Army would be tasked with simulating entire divisions along the river, creating the impression of impending crossings at locations far removed from the true points of assault. In March 1945, as the Allies prepared to cross near Remagen and Wesel, the Ghost Army staged its largest and most ambitious deception to date. Near the town of Raid, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops constructed the illusion of a massive American buildup. Inflatable tanks and artillery lined the fields, their rubber skins glistening faintly under the spring sun. Bulldozers carved tracks through the mud to mimic convoys of trucks and half-tracks, their ruts leading inexorably toward the river. Engineers scattered fake bridges and pontoon equipment, suggesting preparations for a crossing that would never occur. Sound engineers added the auditory weight of this illusion. Massive amplifiers broadcast the metallic clang of bridging equipment, the churn of engines, and the shouted orders of engineers at work. To any German patrol listening across the river, the sounds were unmistakable. The Allies were preparing to cross in force. Radio operators completed the ruse, transmitting traffic that mimicked the chatter of two full divisions, complete with call signs, coded reports, and logistical queries. The deception was multi-layered, synchronized, and overwhelming. The Germans took the bait. Reconnaissance planes reported concentrations of armor and bridging units near Raid. Artillery fire rained down on the empty fields where only rubber and sound existed. German reserves shifted to meet the phantom threat, reinforcing positions opposite the Ghost Army's illusions. Meanwhile, the true Allied crossings proceeded elsewhere. Most famously at Remagen, where American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact, and at Wesel, where airborne assaults and concentrated crossings pierced the German line. Every man and tank diverted by the Ghost Army's deception was one less obstacle at the true points of assault. The Rhine deception revealed the Ghost Army's mastery of its craft. Years of experimentation, improvisation, and risk had culminated in a performance so convincing that even at the Reich's doorstep, with German forces desperate and vigilant, the illusions held. For the men of the 23rd, this was both triumph and vindication. Their rubber tanks, once mocked as toys, had drawn artillery fire from the Wehrmacht. Their recordings, dismissed by skeptics as theatrical, had convinced enemy officers of phantom divisions. Their radios, manned by actors in uniform, had rewritten the enemy's map of the battlefield. Yet triumph was not without cost. The proximity to the front meant that Ghost Army soldiers lived in constant danger. German artillery did not distinguish between rubber and steel. Shells tore through the fields of inflatables with lethal force. Patrols probing Allied lines risked stumbling upon the masquerade, and a single discovery could unravel the deception. The men carried rifles, but they knew full well that against German armor or infantry and strength, they stood little chance. Their courage lay not in firepower, but in the audacity of standing exposed, trusting that illusion itself would shield them. The success of the Rhine operations also underscored the paradox of the Ghost Army's existence. Their victories were invisible by design. Official reports credited the crossings to the heroism of infantry, the power of armor, the brilliance of generals. Few, if any, would speak of the shadows that misled the enemy, of the artists who conjured phantom armies in muddy fields. Their story was swallowed by secrecy, buried beneath the silence of classified files. The men themselves spoke little, bound by oath and the unspoken understanding that their contribution was to remain hidden. But in their hearts, they knew. They knew that their illusions had eased the passage into Germany, that their shadows had spared lives, that their art had hastened the war's end. For the Ghost Army, the Rhine was not merely a river crossed by armies. It was a river crossed by phantoms, a stage where illusion and reality intertwined to shape the fate of nations. As March turned to April and the Allies surged deeper into Germany, the Ghost Army's mission drew toward its conclusion. Soon, the Reich would crumble, and the war in Europe would end. But before the final curtain fell, the men of the 23rd would perform their last great deceptions, ensuring that, to the very end, the Germans fought against not only armies of flesh and steel, but also against ghosts. By April 1945, the war in Europe teetered on its final edge. The Allied armies surged across the German heartland, cities fell in rapid succession, and Hitler's Reich convulsed in its death throes. Yet, in those final chaotic weeks, danger remained. Pockets of German resistance fought with the desperation of the condemned, and the cost of every miscalculation could still be measured in lives. For the Ghost Army, the war was nearly over, but their mission was not finished. In those final days, they would stage some of their boldest performances, illusions that distracted the enemy and paved the way for victory. One of the unit's last major operations unfolded near the town of Kassel in late March and early April 1945. The Allies sought to advance into central Germany, but German defenders, clinging to discipline even in the face of collapse, prepared to resist. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was ordered to simulate the presence of the U.S. 6th Armored Division, drawing German fire and confusion away from the actual spearheads pushing deeper into the country. The operation was characteristic of the Ghost Army at its peak. Inflatable tanks and artillery crowded the fields outside Kassel, arranged with meticulous care to mimic real defensive positions. Tracks and tire marks carved into the mud told the story of convoys and armored units moving into place. Engineers set up dummy command posts, complete with tents, trucks, and camouflage nets. Soldiers donned patches of the 6th Armored, strolling through nearby villages, chatting with civilians, and planting rumors designed to travel quickly into German intelligence networks. Sonic deception once again played its part. Loudspeakers thundered with the clang of bridging equipment, the grinding of armored engines, and the shouted orders of commanders preparing for assault. Radio operators layered the illusion with transmissions that matched the patterns of the 6th Armored, weaving chatter that suggested preparations for a large offensive. To German observers, the Phantom Division was real, threatening to strike at any moment. The deception worked. German forces repositioned themselves to counter the perceived threat near Kassel, leaving Allied spearheads freer to advance elsewhere with less resistance. In effect, the Ghost Army had once more drawn the enemy into shadowboxing, forcing them to fight against rubber and sound while real American forces punched through the weakening front. The Kassel operation was one of more than 20 deceptions executed by the Ghost Army in Europe, but it stood out as a finale of sorts, a demonstration of everything the unit had learned. Their techniques had matured into a seamless performance, a choreography of inflatables, sound, radio, and rumor that no longer seemed experimental but instinctive. Each man knew his role. Each illusion was layered with precision. They had become, in every sense, a professional theater of war. Yet the final weeks were not without peril. As German defenses crumbled, lines grew chaotic, and frontiers blurred. Ghost army soldiers sometimes found themselves perilously close to retreating German troops, their fragile masquerades nearly exposed. There were moments when artillery fire rained down indiscriminately, shredding inflatables and scattering crews. At times, their deceptions were so convincing that even Allied units mistook them for real formations, a dangerous confusion in the fog of war. But as April gave way to May, the Nazi regime collapsed under the weight of Allied and Soviet advances. Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and on May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. For the men of the Ghost Army, the curtain fell on their final act. Their illusions, so carefully crafted, so courageously deployed, were no longer needed. Rubber tanks were deflated, speakers were silenced, and radios went quiet. The artists, engineers, and soldiers who had conjured armies of shadows packed their tools and prepared to return to civilian life. For many, the end was bittersweet. They had risked their lives in service of a mission that demanded secrecy so absolute that even their fellow soldiers often knew nothing of it. They returned home without parades, without recognition, carrying stories they were forbidden to tell. Their war had been one of illusions, and now even their legacy was swallowed by silence. Yet within their ranks, they knew the truth. They knew that their deceptions had saved countless lives, had shaped battles from Normandy to the Rhine, and had contributed in no small measure to the Allied victory in Europe. The Ghost Army's final illusions in Germany were not merely tactical tricks, but symbolic farewells. They were a reminder that war is not won by strength alone, but by wit, imagination, and the courage to embrace the unconventional. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had shown that art could be as potent as artillery, that deception could shield armies as surely as armor, and that even in the darkest of conflicts, creativity had a place on the battlefield. In the silence that followed Germany's surrender, the Ghost Army dissolved back into anonymity. Their story would remain classified for decades, locked in archives, their contributions hidden from public view. But for those who had lived it, those final weeks in Germany marked the end of a journey unlike any other, a war fought not in fire and blood, but in shadows and illusions. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, celebrations erupted across the Allied world. Parades filled the streets of New York, London, and Paris. Flags unfurled, bells rang, and weary soldiers returned home to embraces that seemed long denied. Yet among those ranks, scattered and unremarked, were the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, who carried with them a burden unlike any other. While others spoke freely of the battles they had fought, these men were sworn into silence. Their story, extraordinary though it was, would remain untold for decades. The secrecy was absolute. Classified orders bound them from sharing details of their missions with family, friends, or even fellow veterans. Parents who asked about their sons' roles in the war were told vague tales of engineering or camouflage. Wives who pressed for stories of combat heard evasions about routine service. Comrades from other units, who had glimpsed their inflatable tanks or overheard strange transmissions, were left to wonder at mysteries never explained. The Ghost Army's illusions had not only fooled the Germans, they had fooled history itself. The reasons for this secrecy were both practical and symbolic. The techniques of deception developed by the 23rd had proven so effective that military planners sought to preserve them for potential use in future conflicts. The Cold War loomed on the horizon, with its shifting battle lines of espionage and psychological warfare. To reveal the Ghost Army's methods was to risk rendering them obsolete. Better, the generals reasoned, to bury the knowledge in classified archives, to be drawn out only if needed again. For the men themselves, this silence created a strange dissonance. They had risked their lives repeatedly, often within earshot of German guns, and yet they could not claim recognition. Their courage had been real, but their victories were invisible. No medals commemorated the inflatables patched under fire, the radios that conjured phantom divisions, or the soundtracks that shook valleys with artificial thunder. Instead, the men of the Ghost Army slipped back into civilian life as though their war had been ordinary, as though their brushes with death and genius had been nothing more than footnotes erased from history. This secrecy also imposed psychological weight. Veterans of combat units processed trauma through stories, through the retelling of battles, the honoring of fallen comrades, the recognition of shared sacrifice. The men of the Ghost Army had no such outlet. Their comradeship remained strong, but their experiences were confined to the circle of those who had lived them. For decades, reunions of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were among the few places where the truth could be spoken aloud, where laughter about rubber tanks and whispered memories of near discovery could finally be shared. Outside those gatherings, silence reigned. And yet, in that silence, a deeper truth lingered. The men understood that their contribution had been unique. Unlike other units, their mission had been defined not by destruction but by preservation. Their illusions had saved lives, sparing real soldiers from walking into German fire. Their battles had been fought in shadows, their victories measured in hesitations and diversions. In an age when war was defined by carnage, they had proven that creativity itself could be a shield. That knowledge, even unspoken, offered a quiet pride. Over time, the world moved on. The Cold War dominated headlines. Korea and Vietnam drew new generations into combat, and the Ghost Army's existence remained buried beneath classified files. Some veterans pursued careers that drew from their wartime experiences. Artists returned to their canvases, designers to their drafting tables, sound engineers to their studios. The war had honed their creativity in strange ways, sharpening instincts for illusion and perception. Others set aside their brushes and scripts altogether, embracing the ordinary lives they had once imagined were lost. In both paths, the war's imprint lingered. But secrecy also meant invisibility. When histories of World War II were written, the Ghost Army was absent. Books described the heroics of Normandy, the resilience of Bastogne, the crossing of the Rhine. Nowhere were the shadows mentioned, the phantom divisions that had shaped those very battles. The omission was not accidental, it was deliberate, enforced by classification. For the men who had served, it was another mask, another illusion, this time cast not for enemies but for posterity. The silence endured for decades, broken only by whispers, private journals, and occasional allusions too vague to betray the truth. Families, curious but respectful, sensed the weight of stories untold. Children grew into adulthood unaware of the extraordinary theater their fathers had staged. Grandchildren inherited photo albums filled with ordinary snapshots, never realizing that behind some of those smiles lay secrets of war waged with shadows. For 40 years, the Ghost Army remained a phantom in the annals of history. The men carried their secret with dignity, even as age advanced and comrades passed away. Some feared their story would vanish entirely, lost to the grave. Others believed that someday, the truth would be revealed, and the world would finally understand how a small band of artists, actors, and engineers had fought one of history's greatest wars not with bullets, but with illusions. And so, the Ghost Army entered its long twilight, a silence imposed not by the battlefield but by the very government it had served. It was a silence that preserved their methods for future generations of deception, but also one that threatened to erase their legacy. Only much later, long after the war's end, would the veil finally be lifted, and the ghosts would step from the shadows into the light of recognition. When the German Reich surrendered in May 1945, the Ghost Army's immediate mission was complete. Their inflatables were packed away, their speakers silenced, and their radios gone quiet. Yet their techniques, the art of manipulating perception, the choreography of sound, sight, and rumor, did not vanish with the war's end. Instead, they passed silently into the arsenal of a new struggle, the Cold War. For decades, their work would influence the hidden wars of deception, even as their own names remained buried beneath the weight of secrecy. The Cold War was not fought in the same manner as the global conflict that preceded it. There were no Normandy landings, no grand armored offensives sweeping across continents. Instead, it was a battle of shadows, fought in espionage, propaganda, psychological operations, and proxy wars. In this realm, deception was as valuable as any tank or bomber. The lessons of the Ghost Army. How to conjure strength where none existed. How to mislead the enemy into misallocation of resources. how to manipulate information until illusion seemed indistinguishable from truth, fit perfectly into the new world of clandestine conflict. While official records remained classified, glimpses of continuity emerge in historical fragments. U.S. Army Psychological Operations Units, established and expanded in the late 1940s and 1950s, drew directly from the principles pioneered by the Ghost Army. Leaflets dropped over enemy lines, broadcasts transmitted into hostile territory, and stage displays of military power bore the imprint of those wartime artists who had shown that deception could save lives. In Korea and later in Vietnam, similar tactics of misdirection were employed, from false troop concentrations to staged maneuvers intended to confuse enemy commanders. Though the men of the 23rd were never publicly credited, their influence rippled across these later wars. The broader military doctrine of deception also evolved in ways that echoed the Ghost Army's methods. NATO exercises often included elaborate ruses to mislead Soviet observers, inflating the apparent strength of Western forces. The Soviets themselves were masters of maskirovka, their doctrine of concealment, camouflage, and misdirection, and the West, in response, turned ever more to psychological operations as a counterbalance. In this chess game of perception, the ghosts of World War II found new life, their wartime performances shaping the strategies of an entire era. For the veterans of the 23rd, this continuity brought both pride and frustration. They knew their work had mattered, that their illusions had not been mere curiosities but foundations for future doctrine. Yet they remained unable to speak of it. Even as Cold War tensions dominated headlines and American society braced for the possibility of nuclear war, the men who had first demonstrated deception's potential kept their silence. Their story remained locked in classified vaults, their legacy unacknowledged in public debate. Still, traces of their influence appeared in unexpected places. Some veterans, having returned to civilian life, carried their wartime creativity into careers that continued to shape culture and communication. Fashion designers, illustrators, and sound engineers who had once conjured phantom armies now influenced industries where perception and illusion were equally powerful. Their wartime lessons in the manipulation of sight and sound found peaceful expression in canvases, advertisements, and theaters. The line between their service and their artistry blurred, as though the Ghost Army's mission had been not only to deceive the enemy, but to expand the very horizons of creativity. Meanwhile, within military academies and think tanks, discussions of deception increasingly drew upon the lessons of World War II, though rarely with explicit mention of the Ghost Army. Historians and strategists spoke of Operation Fortitude, the grand deception that protected the Normandy landings, but the smaller, more mobile unit that carried deception into the heart of Europe remained absent from the narrative. Its very existence seemed like a phantom, whispered about but never confirmed, a secret too valuable to expose in the early decades of the Cold War. For the veterans themselves, the Cold War years became an extended twilight. They grew older, raised families, built careers, and attended reunions where stories could finally be told, if only among those who had lived them. In those private gatherings, laughter erupted at memories of inflatables collapsing in the wind, or of German artillery wasted on rubber howitzers. Pride lingered in the knowledge that they had saved lives by drawing fire onto shadows. Yet outside those circles, their experiences remained hidden. They were, in a sense, still performing, their silence another illusion, masking the truth of what they had done. By the 1970s and 1980s, as the Cold War stretched into its final act, the veterans began to sense that their time to share the story was running short. Many had already passed away, taking their secrets with them. Others worried that if the classification endured, the Ghost Army's role would vanish altogether from history. They had fought not for glory but for survival, and yet there was a quiet yearning for recognition, not for medals or monuments, but for truth. To know that their war, fought with rubber and sound, would not be forgotten. The Ghost Army's influence in the Cold War was therefore twofold. On the one hand, it lived in the doctrines of psychological warfare, in the continued reliance on deception as a strategic tool. On the other, it lingered in the silence of its veterans, who carried the memory of illusions even as they watched new generations confront their own wars of perception. Theirs was a legacy written not in books, but in shadows, a hidden chapter of history that shaped the present even as it remained concealed. The Cold War would eventually end, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. But for the Ghost Army, the true end of silence still lay in the future. It would take decades before the veil lifted, before their story finally emerged into the light. Until then, they remained what they had always been: shadows on the battlefield, guardians of secrets, artists whose greatest performance remained unseen. For decades, the story of the Ghost Army remained buried beneath the weight of classification. Veterans grew old under the burden of silence, their families unaware of the extraordinary role they had played in the Great Conflict. Then, slowly, the veil began to lift. Files long locked in government archives were declassified in the mid-1990s, and with them, the truth of a forgotten unit finally emerged. What had once been rumor and myth became history, and the Ghost Army stepped into the light of recognition. The process was gradual. In the years immediately following the war, the U.S. government had classified the Ghost Army's operations at the highest level of secrecy. The justification was simple: deception remained a weapon, and to reveal its techniques was to diminish its power. But as the Cold War thawed and the immediate need for secrecy faded, historians and journalists began to press for access. The Freedom of Information Act opened new avenues for inquiry, and patient researchers uncovered documents that confirmed the existence of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. When those records were finally declassified, the scope of the deception stunned the public. Here was a unit that had staged more than 20 large-scale operations in Europe, impersonating divisions many times their size. Here were soldiers who had hauled inflatables, broadcast soundtracks, and whispered rumors under enemy fire, all while never being allowed to tell their story. The files revealed not only the daring ingenuity of the Ghost Army, but also the secrecy that had long hidden them from history. Journalists, authors, and filmmakers quickly seized upon the rediscovered tale. Documentaries explored the strange theater of war waged with rubber tanks and sonic illusions. Books chronicled the lives of men who had once been artists, designers, and engineers, showing how their creativity had been weaponized in service of survival. Museums mounted exhibitions, displaying inflatables alongside sketches, photographs, and recordings that had once been locked away. For the first time, the Ghost Army's strange and courageous story reached the public consciousness. For the veterans themselves, the declassification was both liberating and bittersweet. Many were in their 70s or 80s by the time they could finally speak openly. At reunions, men who had kept secrets from even their closest kin now shared stories with pride, recounting how they had lured German artillery onto rubber howitzers or convinced enemy commanders of phantom divisions. Families, often hearing these tales for the first time, marveled at the courage and creativity their fathers or grandfathers had carried in silence. Yet declassification also carried a melancholy edge. Many veterans had already passed away, their stories never told, their contributions never recognized. For every man who lived to see his role acknowledged, there were others whose graves remained unmarked by the truth of their service. This absence haunted the survivors, who wondered how much richer history might have been had the Ghost Army story been shared earlier. The rediscovery also sparked a broader reflection on the nature of war and memory. Historians debated whether the secrecy had been necessary, whether the benefits of preserving deception techniques outweighed the cost of erasing the contributions of an entire unit from history for half a century. The consensus, perhaps inevitably, was complicated. The Ghost Army's silence had protected the utility of deception, but it had also obscured a remarkable example of ingenuity and humanity in warfare. As recognition spread, so too did efforts to honor the Ghost Army formally. Veterans were invited to speak at universities, military academies, and cultural institutions. Their story inspired new generations of soldiers and artists alike, showing that courage could take many forms, that creativity could save lives as surely as firepower. In exhibitions, children marveled at the sight of inflatable tanks, laughing at their absurdity, only to learn that these very illusions had drawn enemy fire and spared real soldiers. The absurd became heroic, and the forgotten became celebrated. The declassification marked the end of the Ghost Army's silence, but the beginning of its legacy. No longer confined to the shadows, the unit's story became a part of the broader narrative of World War II, a reminder that war is not only about destruction, but also about imagination. The rediscovery of the Ghost Army was more than the unveiling of a secret. It was the restoration of a truth that history had nearly lost. And yet, even as their story was told, one question lingered. How many other secrets remained hidden? How many other shadows lay in archives still sealed? The Ghost Army's emergence into the light hinted at the vast, unseen dimensions of war, where deception and illusion shaped outcomes as decisively as battles fought with bullets and blood. For the men of the 23rd, however, the rediscovery was enough. After decades of silence, their story was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to history, to their families, and to the generations that would remember them not as anonymous soldiers, but as artists of war, masters of illusion, and guardians of life through deception. For more than half a century, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops lived as phantoms within the history of World War II, present in memory but absent from official recognition. Only after declassification in the 1990s did their story begin to surface, and even then, the path to formal honors was long and uncertain. Recognition does not always arrive swiftly, especially for those whose victories were invisible, fought not with bullets, but with illusions. Yet persistence, advocacy, and the weight of undeniable truth eventually brought the Ghost Army into the light of honor it had long deserved. The first wave of recognition came from historians, museums, and filmmakers. Documentaries such as The Ghost Army, 2013, introduced the public to the unlikely tale of artists and sound engineers masquerading as warriors. Exhibitions showcased inflatable tanks, camouflage sketches, and sound equipment, transforming once secret tools of deception into artifacts of national pride. Universities invited surviving veterans to speak, their audiences often astonished that such a story had remained hidden for decades. These cultural acknowledgments were powerful, but they were not the same as official recognition from the nation they had served. For the veterans, the question of honor lingered. They had risked their lives on European battlefields, operating within range of enemy artillery and patrols. Their illusions had saved thousands of lives, diverting German fire and confusion away from real soldiers. Yet medals and citations went to others, and their names were missing from rolls of decorated units. As years passed and survivors dwindled, advocates began to press for more formal acknowledgement. In the early 2000s, organizations and individuals launched campaigns to secure official recognition for the Ghost Army. Family members, historians, and sympathetic lawmakers gathered testimonies, collected evidence, and brought the story to Congress. Their efforts gained momentum as public awareness grew. Newspapers featured profiles of surviving veterans, detailing how they had inflated rubber tanks under fire or broadcast phantom convoys across frozen valleys. Slowly, the idea that the Ghost Army deserved formal honors took root. The turning point came in the 2010s, when bipartisan support began to build in Congress for a measure to honor the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and their sister deception unit, the 3133 Signal Service Company, which had operated briefly in Italy. Lawmakers acknowledged that recognition was long overdue, that the secrecy which had once concealed the unit's contributions no longer justified their omission from history's honor roll. Finally, in 2022, after years of advocacy, the Ghost Army was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. The medal, bestowed collectively upon the unit, recognized their unique and highly distinguished service during World War II. For the surviving veterans, by then numbering only a handful, the ceremony was a moment of vindication. Men who had once kept silent for decades now stood before the nation, honored not only for their courage but for their creativity. The medal symbolized what had long been known in their hearts, that their illusions had been as vital to victory as the guns of any division. The recognition was more than symbolic. It served as a reminder of the diverse ways in which wars are fought and won. It challenged conventional notions of heroism, showing that bravery could take the form of inflating tanks in a snowstorm, stringing wires for sound equipment under fire, or donning false insignias to plant whispers in enemy ears. The Ghost Army proved that imagination, when wielded with courage, could save lives on a scale measured in thousands. For families of veterans who had already passed away, the honor carried a bittersweet weight. Sons and daughters accepted certificates and replicas of the medal on behalf of fathers who had died before their story was told. They spoke of pride and regret, of wishing those men had lived to see the recognition they had earned. In those moments, the shadows of secrecy lifted not only for the veterans, but for their families, who could finally place their father's service in its true light. The Congressional Gold Medal did more than honor the past. It secured the Ghost Army's place in the nation's collective memory. Schools, museums, and military academies now teach their story as part of World War II history. Future generations will learn that the war was not only a contest of arms, but also of wits, and that sometimes the most powerful weapons are those that never fire a shot. Recognition at last brought closure. For the veterans who lived to see it, the medal was a symbol that their long silence had not erased their contribution. For those who did not, it was a promise kept by history, that their ghosts would no longer be forgotten. And for the world, it was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, creativity and imagination can shine like beacons, turning the tide of war without spilling a drop of blood. When the curtain fell on the Ghost Army's final mission in 1945, the men who had conjured phantoms on the battlefield returned home. They were discharged quietly, without parades or citations, their service folded into the anonymity of a nation eager to move beyond war. Yet beneath the surface of civilian life, each carried the memory of shadows, of nights spent inflating tanks in fields of snow, of radio signals whispered under threat of discovery, of sonic illusions echoing across valleys where real men's lives depended on the trickery of sound. They went on to live lives that appeared ordinary, but the truth of their service never left them. Many of the Ghost Army's veterans returned to the worlds of art, design, and sound from which they had been drawn. Bill Blass, who once stenciled camouflage under fire, became one of America's most celebrated fashion designers, shaping post-war elegance with a creativity honed in deception. Ellsworth Kelly, who arranged inflatables along French ridges, found international acclaim as a painter and sculptor, his mastery of form and abstraction perhaps deepened by his wartime lessons in perception. Arthur Singer, who sketched dummy artillery and camouflage, went on to become a renowned illustrator of birds, his eye for detail sharpened by nights of fooling enemy reconnaissance. Others pursued quieter careers, but carried the Ghost Army's influence in subtler ways. Advertising executives, architects, engineers, and teachers all drew upon the same instincts that had once conjured armies from rubber and rumor. The war had taught them the malleability of perception, the importance of detail, and the power of imagination in shaping reality. Those lessons found new life in canvases, classrooms, and boardrooms, leaving an imprint far beyond the battlefields of Europe. Yet life after the Ghost Army was not always simple. Secrecy weighed heavily. Veterans often avoided questions from family members, responding with half-truths about engineering or camouflage work. Wives and children sometimes sensed there was more, but the silence was rarely broken. Only within the fraternity of fellow veterans could stories flow freely, at reunions, in letters, in the private spaces where those who had shared the masquerade could recall the absurdity and terror of their missions. To outsiders, they were simply veterans of the war. To one another, they were the keepers of a secret theater. The memories were sometimes tinged with humor. Men recalled German artillery units wasting shells on rubber howitzers, or the frantic scramble to patch an inflatable tank that had deflated at the worst possible moment. They laughed at the surrealism of it all, grown men in uniform carrying stage props across battlefields, waging war like actors in an elaborate play. But alongside the laughter lay moments of sobering gravity. The tension of working within range of German patrols, the fear of discovery, the knowledge that their lightly armed unit could have been annihilated had the enemy seen through the deception. Some veterans struggled quietly with the psychological burden of their role. Unlike combat soldiers, they carried few outward scars, but the strain of risking life in secrecy, without recognition, lingered. The paradox of their service, bravery hidden beneath silence meant that for decades, they lacked the outlet of shared commemoration. While others told stories of battles fought, the men of the Ghost Army bore their memories in solitude. As the decades passed, their numbers dwindled, but their bonds remained strong. Reunions became cherished rituals, opportunities to reconnect with the only people who truly understood what it meant to be a soldier of illusion. In hotel conference rooms and veterans' halls, they swapped stories, shared photographs, and reflected on a war fought in shadows. For many, these gatherings were more than nostalgia. They were acts of remembrance, preserving a history the world had yet to recognize. Their lives after the war reflected the resilience of men who had seen death at close hand, but had chosen to embrace creation over destruction. They built families, careers, and communities. They pursued art, music, architecture, and teaching with the same ingenuity that once crafted illusions of armies. Their wartime service had taught them that perception could shape reality, and in peacetime, they used that lesson to build rather than deceive. Yet always, there lingered the quiet knowledge that history had overlooked them. The medals had gone to others, the books had recorded other units, and the parades had marched without them. For decades, they remained anonymous heroes, their contributions hidden beneath the shroud of secrecy. It was only in the twilight of their lives, with declassification and eventual recognition, that they could finally share their stories openly. For the men behind the masks, life after the war was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in the sense that they returned to jobs, families, and routines like millions of other veterans. Extraordinary in that they carried with them memories of a war unlike any other, where brushes, rubber, and sound became weapons, where illusion was a shield, where art and courage intertwined to save lives. Their legacy lived not only in their wartime deceptions, but in the lives they built afterward, lives shaped by the creativity and resilience forged in the crucible of war. The Ghost Army story is more than a tale of wartime ingenuity. It is a window into the deeper truths of conflict and the human condition. Their operations, rubber tanks, booming loudspeakers, radio chatter spun from thin air, might seem like curiosities, even absurdities, in the face of a war defined by brutality and destruction. Yet the very absurdity of their methods illuminates profound lessons about war, about imagination, and about the resilience of the human spirit when confronted with annihilation. The first lesson lies in the recognition that war is not solely a contest of strength, but also of perception. The Ghost Army demonstrated that to shape the enemy's mind was to shape the battlefield itself. Their illusions forced German commanders to hesitate, to misallocate troops, to attack shadows, while sparing flesh and blood. In doing so, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops revealed that perception could be as powerful a weapon as artillery. In an age where machines of destruction dominated, their work proved that the battlefield was not just physical ground, but also the imagination of the enemy. A second lesson is the paradox of courage in vulnerability. The men of the Ghost Army carried rifles, but their unit was never meant for direct combat. If discovered, they would have been cut down with little chance of survival. Yet they placed themselves in harm's way repeatedly, standing within range of German artillery and patrols to stage their performances. Their courage did not lie in overwhelming firepower, but in the audacity of risking death armed with nothing more than rubber, paint, and sound recordings. They embody a truth often overlooked, that bravery is not confined to the battlefield's most violent edges, but also thrives in its quiet shadows. A third lesson is the power of creativity as a force for preservation rather than destruction. The Ghost Army's mission was not to kill, but to deceive. Each successful illusion meant fewer bullets fired at real soldiers, fewer lives lost in brutal combat. In a war that claimed millions of lives, their contribution was a rare reminder that imagination could save rather than destroy. They remind us that even in humanity's darkest hour, creativity found a way to shield rather than shatter. Their story also teaches us about the fragility of memory. For decades, the Ghost Army remained classified, its history hidden even from those it had saved. This silence illustrates how easily the contributions of the unconventional can be erased, how the narratives of war often prioritize tanks, planes, and generals while neglecting the quieter triumphs of deception, ingenuity, and art. That the Ghost Army's story nearly vanished is a warning about the selective nature of history, and a reminder of the responsibility to preserve the voices of those who fought in ways less visible but no less vital. At its heart, the Ghost Army also reveals the enduring tension between truth and illusion. War is often spoken of in absolutes, victory and defeat, good and evil, strength and weakness. But the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops lived in the gray spaces, conjuring illusions that were false in form yet true in effect. Their phantoms were lies, but lies that saved lives. They remind us that truth in war is not always straightforward, that survival often depends on bending perception, on manipulating belief. This moral complexity underscores the human dimension of war. The line between reality and illusion is often blurred, and in that blur, humanity finds both danger and salvation. The Ghost Army's lessons extend beyond the battlefield. In a modern world saturated with information, images, and narratives, their story resonates as a parable about the power of perception in shaping reality. Just as German commanders once moved divisions against phantom tanks, so too can societies be swayed by illusions, by propaganda, by misinformation, by appearances crafted with precision. The Ghost Army teaches us the importance of skepticism, of questioning what we see and hear, of recognizing the artistry behind illusions both in war and in peace. Yet above all, their story teaches us about the resilience of the human spirit. These were artists, designers, and sound engineers, men trained to create beauty, to shape culture, to inspire. In the crucible of war, their creativity was repurposed into deception, yet it remained rooted in the same impulse, to use imagination to influence reality. They remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, creativity endures, and that sometimes, imagination can be the greatest shield of all. The Ghost Army was a paradox, a unit that fought without fighting, that killed without killing, that won battles by pretending to exist. In their paradox lies their deepest lesson, that war, though brutal, is not only about destruction. It is also about survival, ingenuity, and the strange ways in which humanity clings to life. Their illusions remind us that even in war, there is room for creativity, and that sometimes the shadows we conjure can protect the light we seek to preserve.
Though their wartime work remained hidden for decades, the men of the Ghost Army left echoes in the world beyond the battlefield. These echoes emerged not only in the classified doctrines of military deception but also in art, culture, and collective memory. The soldiers of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were, in many ways, a bridge between two worlds, one of war, where illusions shielded soldiers, and one of peace, where imagination became a force for creation. The legacy they left behind continues to ripple outward, shaping how we remember war, how we understand art, and how we interpret the interplay between truth and illusion. One of the most striking cultural legacies lies in the post-war careers of its veterans. Bill Blass transformed from a young camouflage artist into one of America's most influential fashion designers, his eye for form and perception honed in fields where fabric once became a shield. Ellsworth Kelly emerged as a giant of modern art, his mastery of shape, color, and abstraction reflecting lessons first learned in arranging inflatables across European landscapes. Arthur Singer became one of the country's most beloved wildlife illustrators, his attention to texture and pattern sharpened by the wartime need to deceive reconnaissance eyes. These men carried the spirit of the Ghost Army into their civilian work, proof that the boundary between wartime illusion and peacetime creativity was porous. Their legacy also resides in the concept of art as survival. The Ghost Army showed that creativity is not frivolous but essential, that the imagination of an artist can be as decisive as the weapon of a soldier. This recognition has inspired later generations of artists and cultural historians, who see in the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops a reminder that creativity is not divorced from struggle but deeply bound to it. Exhibitions in museums, documentaries, and books have reframed their story not merely as a military curiosity but as a cultural parable. Art has the power to protect, to save, to endure even in the face of destruction. Memory, too, became part of their legacy. For decades, the Ghost Army existed as rumor, half-whispered in veterans' reunions and speculative articles. Only after declassification did their story re-emerge, reshaping the cultural memory of World War II. Their rediscovery altered the narrative of the war itself, broadening it beyond tanks, planes, and generals to include artists with brushes and engineers with amplifiers. In doing so, it reminded the public that war is a tapestry woven from many threads, some loud and violent, others subtle and silent. The Ghost Army's thread, once invisible, now shimmers with recognition. There is also a symbolic resonance in how their story has been embraced in popular culture. Documentaries, museum exhibits, and even works of fiction have drawn inspiration from their deceptions. The image of inflatable tanks in misty fields, of phantom divisions conjured by sound, has captured the imagination of artists and audiences alike. These images blur the line between history and metaphor, suggesting that the Ghost Army's illusions were not only military tools but also enduring symbols of resilience, wit, and human ingenuity. The cultural legacy of the Ghost Army also lives in the way we think about deception itself. Their story complicates the moral landscape of illusion. In most contexts, deception is seen as dishonorable, even shameful. Yet the Ghost Army transformed deception into a force for preservation. Their lies saved lives, their illusions shielded flesh, their falsehoods led to truths measured in survival. This inversion of values has sparked philosophical and artistic reflection, inspiring debates about truth, perception, and the ethics of illusion. In art galleries and classrooms, their story is often invoked as a case study of how context can redefine morality. Beyond culture and philosophy, their legacy endures in the personal stories passed down through families. Once forbidden, these stories now flow openly, children recalling the moment they discovered their father had created phantom tanks, grandchildren marveling at the revelation that their quiet grandfather once staged entire armies. These stories, told around dinner tables and recorded in oral histories, keep the memory alive not only as military history but as family heritage. In these intimate retellings, the Ghost Army lives on as a reminder that behind every historical event are human beings, ordinary men asked to perform extraordinary tasks. The echoes of the Ghost Army reverberate today in both military strategy and cultural imagination. They remind us that war is not just about destruction but also about deception, survival, and creativity. They remind us that memory itself is fragile, shaped by what is told and what is concealed. And above all, they remind us that art, in its many forms, has the power not only to inspire but to protect. The Ghost Army's cultural legacy is thus both practical and symbolic. It lives in the doctrines of psychological warfare that still guide militaries. It lives in the careers of artists who once conjured illusions under fire. It lives in museums, books, and films that tell their story to new generations. And it lives in the way we remember war, not only as destruction but as imagination in the service of survival. Their illusions may have vanished from the fields of Europe, but their echoes remain, resonating in art, memory, and the human spirit's refusal to surrender creativity, even in war's darkest hours.
As the 21st century advanced, the story of the Ghost Army finally stepped into the light of public recognition. Yet time, relentless and impartial, claimed the very men whose memories carried that story. The artists, sound engineers, radio specialists, and camouflage designers who once conjured phantom divisions in the fields of Europe aged into their twilight years. Their ranks thinned with each passing season, until only a handful of survivors remained to tell the tale. In this way, the Ghost Army lived up to its name, its soldiers becoming ghosts not only in the sense of deception, but in the sense of memory, fading into history as their generation passed away. The mortality of the Ghost Army sharpened the urgency of remembrance. Families who had once wondered at their father's cryptic wartime service now gathered oral histories, recorded interviews, and preserved letters. Grandchildren who had grown up hearing only hints of a secret mission discovered, through late-life revelations, the magnitude of what their relatives had done. Museums and historical societies scrambled to capture testimonies before silence claimed them forever. For each veteran lost, a library of stories vanished. Every recorded memory became precious, a relic not of tanks and guns, but of shadows and illusions spun in the crucible of war. The passage of time also revealed the poignancy of their service. Unlike many combat veterans, the men of the Ghost Army had fought a war of invisibility. Their courage had not been celebrated in parades, their achievements unmarked by medals until the very end. Their lives were measured in silence, their victories in deceptions that few were allowed to know. This anonymity made their later recognition all the more meaningful. When they were finally honored with the Congressional Gold Medal, the surviving veterans stood not only for themselves, but for the comrades who had long since passed, for the ghosts who could no longer receive the applause of history. As survivors grew fewer, their story began to belong as much to the living as to the dead. It became the responsibility of families, historians, and communities to carry it forward. In this sense, the Ghost Army's final mission was not waged in Europe but in memory itself, to ensure that their illusions, once secret, would never again be forgotten. Each retelling became an act of resistance against oblivion, a defiance of the silence that had once defined them. The dwindling of the Ghost Army also prompts reflection on the universality of mortality. Every generation passes, its memories either preserved or lost. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops remind us that history is not only about events, but about people. About individuals who lived, feared, laughed, and risked everything. They remind us that even the most extraordinary stories can vanish if not guarded carefully. The Ghost Army, once hidden by classification, faced a second threat of erasure through the natural passage of time. Recognition and remembrance became their final shield. There is a haunting beauty in the way their story mirrors their name. They were ghosts in war, phantoms conjured to mislead the enemy. They became ghosts in memory, soldiers forgotten until archives were opened. And now, as the last of them fade into history, they become ghosts of a generation, shadows whose lives flickered briefly yet changed the course of battles. Their legacy survives not in stone monuments alone, but in the fragile vessel of memory, carried forward by those who believe that even shadows deserve remembrance. To honor the Ghost Army is to honor not only their courage, but the idea that humanity itself resists erasure. In their illusions, they preserved lives. In their silence, they preserved secrets. And in their memory, preserved now by recognition, they preserved the truth that creativity, courage, and imagination endure even as flesh and bone pass away. The ghosts that remain are not only those of the soldiers, but of the illusions themselves. The inflatable tanks that once stood proudly in French fields, the phantom convoys whose engines still seem to echo faintly in memory, the radio chatter that once filled the ether with voices of men who did not exist. These ghosts remind us that reality and illusion often blur, that what is unseen can shape history as powerfully as what is visible. In the end, the Ghost Army's greatest legacy may be this, a reminder that even as generations fade, the stories we choose to remember keep them alive. They were soldiers, they were artists, they were phantoms, and though time will claim the last of them, their illusions endure. Etched now not in secrecy, but in history, where ghosts are transformed into memory, and memory into meaning. War leaves behind many legacies, ruins, graves, medals, and stories. Most are written in fire and steel, in the chronicles of divisions and generals. But some are subtler, quieter, almost invisible, yet no less powerful. The Ghost Army belongs to this second category. Their battlefield was the imagination. Their weapons were illusions. Their victories were measured not in enemy dead, but in allied lives spared. And their silence, long imposed by secrecy, was itself a final act of service, protecting the methods of deception for generations that might yet need them. To reflect upon their story is to confront the paradoxes of war. These men fought by pretending to fight. They lied in order to preserve truth. They created phantoms so that real soldiers might live. Their courage lay not in firepower, but in audacity, the willingness to stand in the shadow of German guns armed with rubber and sound. In their vulnerability, they revealed a deeper strength. The recognition that survival does not always come from destruction, but sometimes from imagination. There is also a lesson about the fragility of memory. For decades, the Ghost Army was forgotten, its story locked away in classified archives. This silence nearly erased them from history, reminding us that the narratives we inherit are shaped as much by what is hidden as by what is revealed. When their story was finally declassified and told, it altered the way we remember World War II, not only as a clash of armies, but as a contest of wits, in which artists and engineers played a role as vital as any division of tanks. The Ghost Army challenges us to think more broadly about heroism, to honor not only those who fought with weapons, but also those who fought with illusions. Their rediscovery in the late 20th century and their recognition in the 21st carry meaning beyond commemoration. They remind us that creativity is not separate from survival, but deeply bound to it. They remind us that art has power not only to inspire, but to protect. And they remind us that even in the darkest hours of history, imagination endures, bending reality itself to preserve life. As the last veterans pass, the Ghost Army becomes what its name always suggested, a memory, a presence felt but unseen. Yet unlike the illusions they conjured in wartime, their legacy is now real and enduring. It lives in museums and books, in classrooms and ceremonies, in the Congressional Gold Medal that finally honored their service. More importantly, it lives in the idea that war need not be defined only by destruction, that wit, creativity, and deception can also alter history's course. In remembering them, we remember more than a secret unit. We remember that humanity, even when forced into conflict, seeks ways to preserve itself. We remember that imagination can be a shield. And we remember that sometimes the most enduring victories come not from what is destroyed, but from what is saved. The Ghost Army has passed into history, but their light endures. Once shadows on the battlefield, they are now illuminations in memory, reminders that even in war, ghosts can protect the living, and that even in death, their story guards us still.